Citizens, friends, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum. I cannot begin to speak today on any subject without first commenting on the sad and melancholy events of the 23rd of March. The 23rd of March is the National Day of Pakistan. It was on this day, 33 years ago, that the leadership of the Muslim League under the banner of the Quaid-e-Azam met at Lahore to pass the historic Pakistan resolution. And since that eventful day, the Muslims of the subcontinent have struggled relentlessly and heroically in the pursuit of the fulfillment of that resolution. And they triumphed over overwhelming odds. At times the odds were so great that it appeared as if the struggle would not reach its culmination, but it did, under the indomitable leadership of Mr. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, our Quaid-e-Azam. Pakistan was achieved. And in these 25 years of tumultuous existence, tragically, we have not yet been able to evolve a sensible equilibrium for our people and for our progeny. The events of December 1971 were traumatic, were most tragic, and many of us had hoped that from this terrible experience we would have learnt a number of fundamental lessons. And one of those lessons was to give shape and stability to what is left of Pakistan, to act within certain disciplined norms of democracy, to accept the other point of view, to be tolerant to the wishes of the majority as long as the majority is exercised through its elected representatives for a period of time, to live in a spirit of accommodation, of give and take. But unfortunately it seems that we have not yet learnt those basic lessons. Otherwise, I fail to understand why some of our friends, or shall we say all of us, should have precipitated what took place on the 23rd of this month. I do not want to dilate on the events. A number of ministers have spoken on the subject. 2 governors have addressed you on this matter. Our friends in the opposition have given their version of it. I'd only like to say this much, that the 23rd of March is a day of celebration, or it ought to be a day of celebration and rejoicing. And for this reason, we participated in the parade, we held a parade, the armed forces showed their caliber, their worth, their magnificence on the parade ground. Many people came to participate in the rejoicing in the spirit of resuscitation for what is left of Pakistan. And it could not therefore be in our minds to mar this fine day by unpleasant events or by fratricidal tussles. And for this reason, we not only appealed to our friends in the opposition, we beseeched them to hold the day to hold their meeting 24 hours later. They could have said the same things that they wanted to say on the 23rd, and perhaps it would have been more appropriate for them to fulminate a day later than on the day which should be symbolic of national unity. They would not have in any way been prevented from doing so. We told them that the police would be extremely busy with the parade and with other arrangements, and that it would not be possible to provide the necessary security arrangements. We had also heard that about 10 to 15,000 armed people were to come in lorries and buses from Charsada and Sahabi. These people did come. They indulged in vitriolic and abusive slogan mongering in the streets, and it could not be called a public meeting. If it was a public meeting, it was a public meeting on wheels. It was an invasion. But even so, we tried to pacify the situation. We did not want to give some of the details about the arrangements. Some of our friends have said that the persons who came were searched and arms were not recovered from them. Arms were recovered from some of them, but the bulk of the arms were brought into Rawalpindi 2 days before the public meeting and were handed over to people who came on the day of the public meeting to them for the public meeting. We didn't go into all these details. We tried to, as I said, pacify the situation. But despite our efforts, our friends are still trying to fan parochialism and try to take advantage of a perverse development. So much so that I hear that yesterday People's Party offices have been ransacked by masked men in Charsada and Utmanzai. I do not believe that there should be any retaliation. There are offices of other parties throughout the country, and I would request my friends, the workers of my party, that not to take any retaliatory measures. One retaliation leads to another, and the spiral keeps mounting. We therefore do not like to see the situation get into some excitable and uncontrollable breath. We'd like to bring it under control. We'd like to see normal conditions restored. And for this reason, I would like to appeal to all my friends and associates throughout the country that they should take a tolerant view of what has happened yesterday in Utmanzai and Charsada and not to hit back. We cannot hit back our own brethren, our own flesh and blood. That is quite puerile. I would also request our friends in the opposition not to become desperate or lose their sense of balance and equanimity, but to retain a sense of composure, a sense of perspective, and to look at the problems of the country from that point of view. My friends, you might say that it's all very well to preach and to indulge in sanctimonious speeches, but what is the evidence of these words in tangible action? How can the sincerity of what you say be measured in concrete terms? It is difficult for me to make out a case for our own government, for your government. It is for you to judge. But at the same time, let me briefly mention the attitude of your government since it came into office towards the opposition in general and towards the whole concept of a democratic dispensation. You will recall that the day I assumed office, on that very day, without negotiations, without preconditions, without any bargaining or negotiation of give and take, of extracting a pound of flesh, unilaterally we lifted the ban on the National Awami Party, a ban that had been imposed by a previous government. if we had a hostile attitude, we could have well taken the position that it will take us some time to consider why the previous government had imposed the ban. We could have taken the position that we will have to sift and examine the evidence on the basis of which the previous government imposed the ban on the National Awami Party. But we did not take that position. We thought we were starting with a clean slate, beginning anew, and that it would be a good thing for bygones to be bygones, although there was some justification to be cautious. So we unilaterally and in good faith lifted the ban on the National Awami Party, imposed not by our government but imposed by a previous government. What did we do after that? We invited our friends from the frontier and Balochistan who in coalition claimed to have a majority, and we held discussions with them. And arising out of those discussions, we reached an agreement for the formation of provincial governments in the provinces of Balochistan and the Northwest Frontier Province, as well as certain other allied important points of agreement were reached through negotiations. Soon after the agreement had been concluded, the leaders of the National Awami Party began to give their own interpretations to the agreement. The agreement was self-evident, it was crystal clear, their point of view was expressed, our point of view was expressed, and the final agreement that had been reached had been written down. These had been published. Nevertheless, the National Awami Party began to give its own interpretations to the agreement, which were not wholly consonant with the letter and spirit of the agreement. What did we do? We did not break the negotiations. We did not, from our side, also violate the agreement, because once an agreement is violated by one party, the other party is also absolved from the commitments of that agreement. But we did not take that position. With patience and with tolerance, so much so that some of our friends in the National Awami Party began to think that the government was basically a weak government and that it was susceptible to pressure. We did not mind even those false conclusions that were reached by them in their enthusiasm. And in all humility, I traveled all the way to Peshawar to have another round of discussions with our friends. I was under no moral obligation to do this, either politically or otherwise, but nevertheless, again out of the spirit of consensus, arising out of the lessons that we had learned from the tragedy of East Pakistan, I swallowed not my pride, but the pride of your government and the pride of principles to some extent. You can never swallow your principles, but to some extent, and we went to Peshawar. I would like to tell you that in the negotiations in Peshawar, our friends were most hostile, they were provocative, they did not for a moment take into account that they were addressing the first elected head of government and state this country has seen in its 25 years existence. Nevertheless, we smiled it out. We said, all right, we'll sit again and arrive at another agreement. And in a lugubrious process of negotiations, we arrived at yet another agreement with them. In this agreement, we went as far as to give these provincial governments the anchorage of having their own governor. Their majority in a coalition was fragile. It was tenuous. And so they needed some anchorage, some support. And for the first time in the history of the subcontinent, Indeed, for the first time in the history of the British Commonwealth states, because the same pattern applies for all the British Commonwealth states, whether they're inside the Commonwealth or outside the Commonwealth, the constitutional arrangements have been the same from the beginning. We gave them governors of their own choice and from their own parties. This was unprecedented. Many of my friends told me that I was taking too great a risk and that I will have no independent agency of knowing of what was happening in those two provinces. I nevertheless, in good faith, agreed to take this unusual, this extraordinary step, this step which in legal phraseology is called sui generis, and gave to the two provinces governors of their own party and of their own choice. And in the 9 to 10 months that our friends were in office, to what extent the two governors acted as agents to the president is in itself a comedy of a unique nature. But we leave that also aside. What about our attitude towards the opposition in general? This is towards our, I have just related briefly, very briefly, about our attitude towards the two political parties which together form the governments in Balochistan and the frontier. But I'd now like to touch upon our attitude to the opposition in general. Let me tell you briefly again, without violating confidence of the discussions we've had with quite a number of them. And if I were to place those discussions before you, there would be no need for me to make a long speech, but that will not be done. One of the leaders of the opposition was anxious or wanted to leave the country and serve the country from abroad, and we immediately agreed and we gave him an important position. Another leader of the opposition, who is today in the forefront of all that is happening, he met me in Murray with the gentleman who has gone to London, and he told me that he was fed up with politics and he wanted to retire from internal politics, and he wanted the government, he wanted us to provide him a position abroad. Now I can tell you most sincerely that we did our best to try and get him this position. It was not in our hands. Many other countries had to decide. But on our part, we made a sincere effort to give him this position. We did not succeed, because as I told you just now, that the decision was not in our hands. A number of other countries had also to participate in the decision for that post. And since we did not succeed, apparently he thinks that we have not played cricket with him. But we did play cricket, and there is evidence of it. However, we leave that aside also. Another stalwart now in the opposition, he came and he sang my praises. And in the National Assembly, this National Assembly, the same man who's attacking us today, he said that I am so popular in his house that adorned in all the rooms of my photographs, and that his children worship me and that his family worships me. These are speeches that our friend has made in the National Assembly. And he came to me with also certain personal matters. I told him that I would try to accommodate him within the norms of justice and equity. Apparently this was not possible, and he has now got so irritated and angry that he sees nothing but disaster in front of everyone's face. But the beginnings of the dispute were of a very trivial nature. And of course then there are our good friends from my own party who were elected to the National Assembly. How they were elected, under what circumstances they were elected, that is not only for them to know, and they know it, but those who cast the votes for them. Here they can come and make brave statements about their strength and about their leadership qualities. But the people back in their own constituencies, the nameless ones, the individuals who voted for them, they know better. They know on what considerations and on what grounds they cast their vote for them. They know when they asked for the ballot paper having the sword, why they asked for the ballot paper having the sword. But I don't want to go into that also, because my object is not to be acrimonious. I'm just trying to tell you about our general attitude towards the opposition. Any opposition leader, whether he's an MNA or if he's even a worker of another party, I have tried to meet him. I've tried to accommodate to their point of view. I have given meetings and interviews to most of them. I have met them with respect. I have met them as equals. And that is because we believe in the democratic traditions. But it's not possible to satisfy each and every individual aspiration, and especially when those aspirations are unreasonable and extremely high. But nevertheless, we have done our best within the limits of equity, as I said, and the propriety of good government to accommodate their point of view. However, when that's not possible, they find here or there some vague or nebulous basis to try and give vent to their anger and their disappointment. Before going to Simla, I called almost all members of the opposition to Murree, and I had marathon discussions with them. I met all of them. I asked them to give me their point of view. I gave them my point of view. We discussed the matters, the question of peace with India, question of prisoners of wars, withdrawal of forces, recognition of Bangladesh, all these questions I discussed with them. I was under no obligation as the leader of the majority party to hold these discussions. Nevertheless, I invited all of them and I held these discussions with them in a spirit again of accommodation, of trying to accommodate their point of view. After coming back from Simla, I immediately took the Simla agreement to the National Assembly. There is nothing in the interim constitution for us to take the agreement to the National Assembly. There is no provision that the agreement must be subject to the approval of the National Assembly. Nevertheless, out of a spirit of democratic tradition, accommodation, compromise, and out of the need to arrive at consensus, I took the Simla agreement to the National Assembly and had it debated by the National Assembly threadbare, without restriction, for a period of 4 to 5 days. Here again, we went forward, submitted to the National Assembly, to the democratic procedures, in order to create new customs, new traditions for orderly, decent, and good government in Pakistan. After that, we invited all the members in the National Assembly who represented political parties or the independents to a conference on the principles of the Constitution. We held 4 days discussion with all the representatives inside the National Assembly on the principles of the Constitution. Here again, we held minute, threadbare discussions. And on the 20th of October, 1972, we arrived at a unanimous agreement on the principles of the Constitution. And let me tell you, and this cannot be rebutted or refuted by the opposition, that most of the agreements, most of the suggestions incorporated in the agreements emanated from the opposition. It was out of a spirit of conciliation and compromise that we went to the edge of the precipice in order to arrive at a consensus with the opposition. Although we were the majority party, although there was no need for us, technically speaking, to arrive at this consensus, nevertheless, out of the same considerations that I have repeatedly mentioned, and because we want to build Pakistan into a strong and formidable fortress, we arrived at an agreement of the principles of the Constitution. These principles were hailed by the leaders of the opposition. They gave statements, they gave broadcasts upholding the principles of the Constitution. And after that, you know what happened. I do not have to go into that story. But even after that, even after they resiled and retracted from their own given word, why should I say given word, from their own written word, signed, sealed and delivered, even after that, and you can always find an excuse. You can find an excuse to violate the most sacred of books. People violate the most holy of books and they give some excuse or the other. Whether they are Christians, Jews or Muslims, they give some reason or the other. So they can give some reason or the other to violate the agreement, but objectively, the common man knows that there is no justification for them to have violated the agreement. But after that, also, we took a conciliatory position. So much so that Mr. Bizenjo, my friend, he approached the governor of Punjab and told him that he and the president of the National Awami Party wanted to have a settlement and that we should meet to have further discussions for a settlement. I told the governor of Khar, I've got no objection to meet them for this purpose. So we met at Lahore. And in Lahore, the president of the National Awami Party told me that the question of the two-third majority was not an important question, and that there were certain little things that had to be done, certain face savers that had to be found only to be able to convince their firebrands and their militant elements to accept the constitutional award and accord with some minor modifications, which he termed as face saver. And he told me that if Mr. Bizenjo and Mr. Rafi Raza get together, there will be no difficulty whatsoever for them to arrive at a settlement. And he said that, well, as far as democracy is concerned, that is what we have to tell the public. I am a feudal, you are a feudal, and therefore we are basically feudal, and as far as democracy is concerned, that's only for public meetings. I only smiled, and I told him, all right, I will ask Mr. Rafi Raza to meet Mr. Bizenjo. And the president of the National Awami Party told me, this is a great relief now, and we can get on with the job. When he left me and the governor of Punjab, he gave a statement to the press. And he said, the Kissingers have met to sort out the technicalities. Therefore, a second informal agreement was reached. Not only the agreement of the 20th of October, which you all know, but another informal agreement was reached. I say it was an informal agreement because I told the two gentlemen that, you know, there's a saying in English, once bitten, twice shy. Now, although we have agreed informally to these modifications, we are not going to put them to the people. You put them to the people by getting your working committee or your council to suggest these modifications, and once your working committee or your council suggests these modifications, we will accept them. But they will not come as our proposals, because we cannot in any way reopen the accord. Our hands have been bitten. And they said, all right, we'll put it to our working committee and there'll be no problem. Soon thereafter, they met and they sent us a reply that 2 or 3 young boys from Sindh and 2 or 3 young boys from Punjab were not agreeable to the modifications. They were told by us that you are the leaders, these are minor modifications. How can you allow, as you say, 2 or 3 young boys from Sindh or 2 or 3 young boys from Punjab to come in the way of such a fundamental matter? You can convince them, you can tell them that after all you are finally responsible as leaders, and in any case your party does not have a majority in Punjab and Sindh. You claim to have a majority in Balochistan and Frontier, although you don't have a majority in Balochistan and Frontier. But you nevertheless put on those airs that you have a majority in Balochistan and Frontier. And can't you then tell them that in any case you are not the majority party of the electorate as far as Sindh and Punjab are concerned, and then you leave it to 2 or 3 boys to torpedo and to break down the whole national edifice? I said, at this rate, how can Pakistan hope to move forward? But they said, well, we can't help it. Now we cannot do anything more. But I'm telling you about our attitude. I'm telling you about their attitude. That is not all. Inside the committee, which had to deal with the Constitution, the draft committee on the Constitution, where all parties are represented, in that committee, a draft Constitution came before the nation, approved by all the parties with 1 or 2 dissenting notes, and dissenting notes are written in all important documents. But even in the draft Constitution, we made certain adjustments, we agreed to certain of their amendments. Not only in the draft Constitution, but when the Constitution came before the Constituent Assembly, we have agreed to a number of their amendments inside the House. We have accepted them. We have accepted some of their amendments in the committee. We have accepted some of their commitments, their amendments in the National Assembly, in the Constituent Assembly. So I would like to tell you that from the beginning, our attitude has been one of discussion and dialogue, one of tolerance, one of compromise, one of give and take, one of adjustment, one of accommodation. At every provocation, we have not hit back by provocation. We have not added tension to tension. Whenever they have tried to slam the door, we have tried to open the door. Whenever they have tried to take a belligerent and bellicose attitude, we have tried to take a graceful and a democratic attitude. I've told you that before going to Simla, I consulted them. After coming back from Simla, we put the agreement to the House, although there was no justification to put the agreement to the House. We had one agreement with the NAP and JUI, they broke it. We had another agreement with NAP and JUI. We gave them governors to which they were not entitled. We gave them a spirit of complete cooperation and understanding. And we accepted their amendments in the committee, we accepted their amendments in the House. We came to a constitutional agreement with them on the 20th of October. After that, we came to an informal agreement with them in Lahore in the end of January. Now what more, my friends, my brothers, my countrymen, you expect us to do? We are the majority party. We have been charged with the responsibility of giving this country a constitution and giving it stability and of providing its people the means of progress and the means of development. But if this is going to be the attitude of the opposition, how can we proceed? How can we tackle the multitude of problems that face Pakistan? It becomes almost an impossible situation. But it is not an impossible situation. We are seized of the situation. We are aware of these little pranks and little tricks and these little intrigues which have almost destroyed Pakistan, which have brought us to this pass. So we are not going to allow them to succeed. We are going to continue in the same spirit of give and take, of accommodation, because a party which is based on principles can show the necessary flexibility within the framework of those principles. Now, ladies and gentlemen, my friends, my brothers and sisters, is it going to be the fate of Pakistan that this is the only country in the world which will be without a constitution? Is it written in the fate line of Pakistan that you do not have a constitution on your fate line? The rest of the world has a constitution written on the fate line of every nation, but on the fate line of Pakistan, there is no line showing that it has a constitution. I say this because in 1947, both India and Pakistan were divided. Both India and Pakistan were governed by the Government of India Act 1935, read with the Indian Independence Act of 1947. Within a matter of 3 years, the Indian people, who had basically the same problems of autonomy, readjustment between the center and the provinces, linguistic demands and the like, they gave their country a constitution. In Pakistan, from 1947 to 1954, the first Constituent Assembly danced and dabbled with the debates on the constitution for almost 7 to 8 years. But even after all that dancing and debating, after 8 years, when a draft constitution was to come up before the Constituent Assembly, and the country was to have a constitution, good or bad, but it was to have a constitution, and that would have been a democratic constitution, because the first Constituent Assembly of Pakistan had a clear and a genuine mandate to frame a constitution. And when it was on the eve of fulfilling its task, after 8 years of dilly-dallying, the Constituent Assembly was dissolved. Illegally dissolved, arbitrarily dissolved. Then afterwards we came into the melting pot. Because once you get off the democratic road, you get into the melting pot, and it becomes very difficult to get back on the democratic road. As you have seen yourselves, it took us 3 wars. It took the dismemberment of the country to bring us back to the democratic road. And I am not going to allow this country to go back from the democratic road into the arms of chaos as long as I am the President of Pakistan. I have a solemn responsibility to the people of Pakistan. And I will under no circumstances open the floodgates of chaos, because we have known what happened. In 1954, the democratic path was abandoned, and as I said, we fell into the melting pot. We tried to evolve a second Constituent Assembly, but that second Constituent Assembly did not have a mandate, did not have a genuine mandate from the people to frame a constitution. That arose out of the illegal act of Ghulam Muhammad. And from an illegal act, you cannot give a legal act. When the source is illegal, it cannot provide a legal sanction. But that second Constituent Assembly, although it did not have the authority or the responsibility to frame a constitution, it framed a constitution called of 1956. That was not a democratic constitution, but it lasted for 2 years because it was not a democratic constitution. Because it was not a constitution of the people, because it was not a constitution framed by the duly elected representatives of the people, it fell. Then came the one-man constitution of 1962. It was inevitable. It had to go because it was a constitution of one man. Then came Yahya Khan, and he tried to give a constitution. It was inevitable that his constitution also could not see the light of day, and if it saw the light of day, it would soon be buried because it was not a constitution provided by the people. Nevertheless, please hear me. Please think and remember that these very friends of ours, most of them, except for some of the members of the NAP, I think, they all hailed Yahya Khan's declaration that he was going to provide a constitution to Pakistan. Except for the Pakistan People's Party, except for the chairman of the Pakistan People's Party, each one of them proclaimed Yahya Khan as a savior for providing a one-man constitution to Pakistan. Where were their concepts of democracy at that time? Had they forgotten the fundamental lessons of democracy, what democracy meant? Is it democracy that one man should give a constitution? I suppose in their book it is democracy because they want a minority to give a constitution. One man means a minority, either a coterie or a one man. Therefore today, because they endorsed one man to give a constitution, they want a minority to impose its diktat on the people of Pakistan. A minority, a one man or a coterie cannot impose its diktat on the whole people. But this is the way they want it. And that is why they hailed Yahya Khan's one-man constitution. Not only that, but the president of the Jamaat-e-Islam, Maulana Tufail, he had one meeting with Yahya Khan. Yahya Khan did not show him the constitution. The constitution of Yahya Khan was framed by a Christian called Cornelius. Without seeing the constitution written by this Christian, without as much as opening the first page of that constitution draft, Mia Tufail, after he leaves Yahya Khan, he holds a press conference and he says in that press conference that he is satisfied that it is an Islamic constitution. Now a constitution written by a Zimmi, a constitution written by a non-Muslim, a constitution written by one man, a constitution that Mr. Tufail has not even seen. That constitution he proclaims to be an Islamic constitution. And he says he's fully satisfied, without looking at it or without reading it, that it is going to be an Islamic constitution. And this constitution draft, in which they have all played a role, this constitution draft, which has more provisions about the Islamic character of the constitution than the 1956 constitution or any other constitution of Pakistan or any other constitution of any Muslim country, and nevertheless they are opposed to it. It is their draft, they have played a part in it. It is a draft which is supported by the majority party. It is a federal constitution, yet they are opposed to it. They say that they cannot agree to it. But why? Under what circumstances? Under what compulsion of logic? Under what compulsion of reason? Under which concept of rationality? Under what norm of democracy do they take this position? My friends, I put this question to you. Now, let me tell you, after this, that there's no basic concept of, there's no basic conflict of principle. There's no basic concept of principle, conflict of principle. I'm sorry, there's no basic conflict of principle. There's no basic conflict of principle for the following reasons. Number one, the accord of 20th of October is an all-party accord. All those parties who are in the National Assembly and the independents are a party to the accord of the 20th of October, which lays down the principles of the Constitution and on the basis of which the draft has been presented to the Constituent Assembly. That is number one, to show that there is no conflict of principles. Secondly, we arrived at an informal agreement in January in Lahore for certain minor modifications. That agreement also stands as far as we are concerned. We have not gone back on it. Our erstwhile friends have gone back on it. That's number two, to show that there is no conflict of principle. Thirdly, on many of the articles that are before the Constituent Assembly, all the members of the opposition have voted for those articles. How can they reject the whole Constitution when they have participated in the Constitution making up to the second reading? Not only participated in it, but delayed the framing of the Constitution up to this point. Not only that, but have also agreed unanimously to many of the amendments that they have suggested, and also to many of the articles of the Constitution. There has been unanimous agreement. When you agree unanimously to many parts of a document, how can you then reject the document as a whole? Because you're a party to accepting so many parts of that document. Therefore, you cannot reject that document as a whole. If you have nothing to do with it from the beginning, if you say, I wash my hands from this exercise, that I will not participate, that I will not put my foot into the National Assembly, that I will have nothing to do with it, that plague be on the National Assembly, in that case you can take the position that I said plague on this house. I said this house is contaminated, and therefore I cannot accept what comes out of this house. But when you are in that house, when you have been sent to that house by the people to frame the constitution, when you have participated in the framing of the interim constitution, when you have participated in giving a vote of unanimous confidence to me, when you have participated in the draft committee of the constitution, when you have participated in the agreement of 20th of October, when you have participated in the informal agreement of January in Lahore, when you have participated in the debates, and in the first reading you have made your speeches, in the second reading you have made amendments which have been accepted, you have agreed to articles inside the House on the second reading, how can you suddenly and whimsically whistle out of your commitments? This is not so simple. And history is not going to absolve you from blameworthiness for taking such a position. You cannot take these matters so lightly. You're not playing marbles at home. You're not eating candy with your children. You're playing with the destinies and the lives of a whole nation, of a battered and a bashed nation, of a nation that has suffered terribly, of a nation that has been lacerated, of a nation that has been a victim of aggression 5 times in its history, of a nation against whom international and internal intrigues are still taking place, so much so that in Islamabad, under our very nose, we found arms in a foreign embassy. What were those arms meant for? What was the purpose of bringing an arsenal and placing it in Islamabad? Now, in this situation, when there are international forces and internal forces relentlessly driving away at the unity of Pakistan, you take the position, after having gone the whole road with us in framing the constitution, after having received a stamp from the people of Pakistan to go and frame a constitution, that you are not going to participate in the constitution making. What juveniles are you? Are you juveniles, or are you playing with fire? But whose fire? The fire of your own home? I can understand you playing with fire of some distant lands. You know, some foreign countries say, well, if some backyard is to burn, let it not be our backyard. But you are burning your own backyard. You are burning your own front yard. And on what ground? On a ground when there is no conflict of principle. I have mentioned here. I have mentioned to you that there is no conflict of principle. Where is the conflict? Is there a conflict over the federation? Certainly not. Is there a conflict that the constitution is being framed by a democratically elected assembly? Certainly not. Is there a conflict over the Islamic provision of the constitution? Certainly not. Indeed, ladies and gentlemen, my friends and countrymen, my brothers and sisters, the letter they wrote to me recently, in that letter they have said that there is full agreement on the question of autonomy. Now, please remember, it is written by these very friends of ours that there is full agreement on the concept of autonomy, on the quantum of autonomy, which means on the federal character of the constitution. Now this, ladies and gentlemen, is the heart of the problem. This is the problem of problems. This is the problem which led to our country's division, autonomy. Autonomy has been the problem from the beginning, since the day the British came into the subcontinent. When the British conquered the subcontinent, for over 60 years or so, they gave no reforms. They gave some reforms in 1862, I think, but they were not reforms relating to autonomy. The first reform they gave was in 1909, the Minte-Maule reforms. They did not really touch upon autonomy. The next reform was the Montagu reforms of 1919. Those reforms also did not basically touch upon the question of autonomy. After that came the Simon Commission. Sir John Simon's Commission came to the subcontinent in 1928. The main problem at that time was the quantum of autonomy. After the efforts of Simon came the Round Table Conference in London. Here again, the main problem was the question of autonomy of the federating states. after the Roundtable Conference came the Government of India Act of 1935, which for the first time had measured the autonomy, but not a satisfactory measurement. So the struggle continued. Then we came to the independence of Pakistan and India. There again, autonomy was the main problem. What would be the safeguard to the Muslims? Safeguard means autonomy. Even the concept of Pakistan is based on the concept of autonomy, that an autonomy within the federation was not a sufficient safeguard, therefore Pakistan had to separate from the federation to become an independent state. If the Muslims had been assured that they would have received sufficient safeguards by the autonomy of a united constitution, there might not have been separation as is envisaged by the Cripps mission and also subsequently by the ABC formula, which the Quaid-e-Azam accepted but Gandhi rejected. So the whole struggle of the subcontinent from the beginning has really been on autonomy. In our own country, our tragic division between East and West Pakistan was over autonomy. They wanted autonomy which amounted to separation. We said autonomy within Pakistan, not autonomy outside Pakistan, and this is how the deadlock came. Now, this problem which has been baffling us from 1909 to 1972, our friends admit that it has been settled. Is this not a great achievement of your government? Of your government? I cannot call it my government because it's not my government. It's your government. Is this not a signal triumph of your government? That in spite of the clash of emotions, in spite of all the humdrum that is going on and all the confusion that is being enveloped into the atmosphere, in this welter of confusion and chaos, they admit that your government has succeeded in closing the issue of autonomy. Once the issue of autonomy is closed and admitted by them, as late as the letter they wrote to me, that over autonomy there is no controversy. If over autonomy there is no controversy, if over the division of powers between the central government and the provincial government there is no controversy, then what is the controversy over? Can you say the constitution not being framed by the democratic majority of this assembly, democratically elected for the first time in 25 years history of Pakistan? If you have come to a settlement on federation, if you could have called Yahya Khan's constitution, which you did not see, which was written by a Christian, an Islamic constitution, then how can you not call a constitution which provides more Islamic provisions than the 1956 constitution and which provides more Islamic provisions than any other Islamic constitution as not an Islamic constitution? There is therefore no conflict of principles on federation, autonomy, on the democratic character of the constitution or on the Islamic provisions. Then what is all this trouble about? Why should people be killed? Why should invasions take place from Charsada? Why should innocent people of our country be butchered in cold blood? Pray, there must be some reason. There must be some justification. Have we all gone mad? No, we have not all gone mad. But this is the path of madness. And I cannot, in my position, succumb to this path of madness. This constitution provides fundamental rights. It provides the independence of judiciary. In that situation, I fail to understand when they have sat with us to frame the constitution, to approve of its draft, to come to settlement of the principles of the constitution, why suddenly now they want to ride out of their responsibilities. I can tell you quite clearly that the participation of the opposition is desirable for the framing of the constitution. I have never hidden the fact that it is not desirable. I have always said that it's much better in a democracy to have a consensus, to have agreement, for everyone to try and participate. I believe in participation. I believe in participation. I believe in accountability, as I said in my first speech to the nation. So I believe that it is desirable that they should participate in the constitution making because they have been given a mandate by the people not to run away from the assembly, but to participate in the assembly and to frame the constitution. At least to participate in the assembly and not to run away from it or to boycott it. This is their mandate which the people have given them. Otherwise, why should the people have elected them? The people elected them to go inside the assembly. The people didn't elect them to sit outside the assembly, in the coffee shops and in the canteen rooms. But that's what they're doing. They're sitting in the canteen room and doing gupshup while the nation fate is in the balance. They're making demands, preposterous, unreasonable demands. They are trying to impose the diktat of the minority on the majority. They are trying to provide themselves with a veto over the constitution. If the veto over the constitution is necessary, then why go through the whole rigmarole and paraphernalia of democracy? Then let one man frame a constitution, or let a coterie frame the constitution. But we went through all these sacrifices that a one man should not frame a constitution, that a coterie should not frame a constitution, that a minority should not impose its will on the majority. That's why we held elections after 25 years. That's why Pakistan in the process has been dismembered, and that is why our people are suffering under the groans of poverty. Please allow me to tackle the problems of poverty. Please allow me to tackle the problems of social economic betterment. You're giving me no rest, you're giving me no time. You're pulling me in all directions. I am being pulled by these constitutional controversies, pulled by international forces, Simla Agreement, withdrawal of forces, prisoner of wars, Bangladesh, in all multitude and diverse directions. In that situation, how can I concentrate on the central task of economic and social development? Perhaps our friends, these diverse and heterogeneous elements, divisive forces, do not want us to tackle the basic problems of poverty and of the question of social injustices. That is why they want us to keep us spinning all the time, spinning round and round all the time. That our energy is dissipated. Our minds do not go to the main problem. We are all the time trying to put our hands together to keep Pakistan one piece. This is hardly the approach. So therefore, it is our duty, it is our sacred and our solemn duty, it is our duty to man and God, that this country must have a constitution. This is the will and the craving of the people. Not only the will of the people, the craving of the people. The people want a constitution. For 25 years, they have been thirsty for a constitution. Their thirst is there. It's quenched. With quenched tongue, they want a constitution. With hunger, they want a constitution. They want this document, and it's going to be framed by a democratically elected assembly of the House. And no force on earth, at least on earth, God in his heaven is the final arbitrator of everything. But no force on earth is going to prevent us from giving Pakistan a democratic constitution. Nobody will be able to tell us that we did not make every singular and collective effort to bring about the cooperation of the opposition. Nobody can tell us that we were rigid and we were inflexible, that we were dogmatic or doctrinaire in our approach in giving a constitution to Pakistan. We have been open-minded, we have been liberal, we have been magnanimous, but finally, if it comes to the test, to the litmus test, whether this country is going to have a constitution or not, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who owes his duty to the people of Pakistan, is going to see, come what may, that this country gets a constitution which is democratic and which is endorsed by the will of the people. This cannot be prevented by any frailties and foibles. This cannot be prevented by semantic jugglery and chicanery that our friends in the opposition are indulging in. I have not been given a mandate to violate the constitution. I have been given a mandate to frame the constitution. I have not been given a mandate to walk out of the National Assembly. I have been given a mandate to be inside the National Assembly. And let me tell you how. Out of a house of 146, my friends, there are 88 members of the Pakistan People's Party, out of which 82 are fulfilling their party and state obligations. 82 from People's Party. 6 of them have fallen by the way path. there are 10 members of Muslim League of Mr. Qayyum Khan, out of which 9 are supporting the government. There are 2 representatives from East Pakistan. Both are supporting the government. There are 7 tribal MNAs. All the 7 are supporting the government. There are 3 members of JUP who are supporting the government. There are 3 members of the Council Muslim League who are supporting the government, and Mr. Doltana is representing the government as ambassador in London. 2 convention leaguers are supporting the government. This shows that out of a house of 146, the government party and its supporters from different parties and independents total 109. And if you take Mr. Doltana into account, and you have to take him into account because he is representing the government in England, we come to 110. 82 of the People's Party and the rest are from different parties, independents, tribal MLAs, Council Muslim League, Convention Muslim League, Qayyum Muslim League, and JUI. Altogether, we come to 110. The opposition, together with those from our party, 6 members who have violated their party's mandate and are now abusing their chairman, together with them, they constitute 37 members in the House. Now, what does democracy mean? Does democracy mean the rule of the majority, or does democracy mean the rule of the minority? If democracy means the rule of the majority, then out of 147 members, we hold the support of 110. If democracy means the rule of the minority, then 37 members can veto and impose their diktat on 110 members in the assembly. It is for you to work out the mathematics of democracy. It is for you to come to the final conclusion as to whether it is plus or minus that makes democracy. It is for you to decide. It is too simple a thing for me to say anything about it. But now remember, when East Pakistan was a part of Pakistan, and when Mr. Mujibur Rahman got his majority, all these friends of ours, each and every one of them said that he is the majority, Awami League is the majority, and the Awami League has a right to give a constitution to the whole country because they are in the majority. We said the country comprises of 2 wings. In the western wing, Mr. Mujibur Rahman's Awami League did not get a single seat. In the 4 provinces of West Pakistan, not a single seat was taken by the Awami League. Not only that, where the Awami League candidates contested, they lost their security deposits. So we said that this factor is important. But we said this is not a decisive factor. We said that Mr. Mujibur Rahman is not giving the country a federal constitution. The 6 points is a formula for confederation. 6 points is a formula for 2 states. If there are going to be 2 states, then how can one state give the constitution for the other state as well? If you want one state, then abandon some of the points in the 6 points, and we are prepared to sit in the opposition. But finally, we took the position that all right, we will go to the National Assembly in Dhaka, provided our point of view is heard, and if it is considered to be reasonable by the majority, that it is accepted. That was finally the only condition that we put forward, which was really no condition, to a country that was divided into 2 parts, where the representative of one part of that wing of that country wanted to impose a confederal constitution. That means impose its dictatorship on the other wing, without the other wing having any voice in the formulation of that constitution. At that time, these friends of ours said, never mind. Whatever Mujibur Rahman wants to give, he has a right to give because he constitutes the majority. Now why are they saying that if even one member from Balochistan does not vote, it will not form a part of the federal structure? This is a federal constitution. This is not a confederal constitution. But even in a federal constitution, which is a constitution for one state and not for two states, they are taking the position that even if one member from Balochistan refuses to participate, then that constitution is not binding on Balochistan. When we said that we are a majority from Punjab and Sindh, which were the two most populous provinces of Pakistan, both in the Central Assembly as well in the provincial assemblies, at that time they said we are impeding the task of constitution making and coming in the way of the majority party, which was East Pakistan. Very strange that these people should have the audacity, that they should have the effrontery to indulge in this kind of double dealing. I tell you quite frankly that never before in my life have I come across a norm of politics so lacking in scruples, so totally devoid of integrity. My dear friends, I say this because we stand by principles. We have always stood by principles. Principles to us are sacred. Because principles are sacred, we can, within the limitations of those principles, be flexible. Now, they tell us that we should recognize this UDI. I don't call it UDF because it is really a unilateral declaration of illegality, like the UDI of Rhodesia. This is a unilateral declaration of illegality. They tell us that we should deal with the UDI. I would have no objection to dealing with the UDI. This is no new monster that has come into being which terrifies us. But there are certain reasons why we cannot deal with the UDI. There are certain reasons based on principles. In the first place, UDI comprises of people who have been defeated in elections, like my friend Nawabzada Nasrullah Khan, people who were too afraid of contesting the elections, and I do not want to name them because they are saintly people, and a motley group of individuals. We recognize a political personality rooted in a political background and in a political mooring and a political situation. We cannot suddenly recognize little weasels that appear here and now. Pop, they come up, and pop, they go down. This has been our attitude from the beginning. You take the attitude of my party, of my party to DAC, Democratic Action Committee, which was set up in Dhaka. Many of these friends of ours joined DAC. We refused to go to DAC. We said we are prepared to discuss with political parties and political personalities separately. We are a political party. We cannot merge our political party, our political identity, our political struggle with something else for a short period of time which comes into being on account of an expedient ambition. Not for any lasting purposes or for lasting principles. That is a political party that goes through the whole vicissitude of life, the ebb and flow of political life, whether there's martial law, whether there's democracy, whether there's dictatorship, whether there's war and peace. That is the role of a political party. But not suddenly things that emerge for expedient considerations. Therefore, we did not deal with DAC for this reason. For the same reason, I did not go to the Round Table Conference. Because the Round Table Conference was not a conference based on principles. The whole object of the Round Table Conference was to keep afloat an individual who had been rejected by the people. How could we participate in that conglomeration of vehicles of expediency when we had known that the people had given their verdict against the perpetuation of that discredited individual? Therefore, we didn't touch the Round Table Conference. We kept our separate identity. Then, my friends, there came the combined opposition party during Yahya Khan's time. Again, these people got together, not for any principles, but just to keep the People's Party out of office, out of power, because the People's Party was a people's party. Because the People's Party wanted to bring about reforms and changes. Therefore, they all got together and they formed the COP. But we didn't deal with the COP.
We refuse to deal with the COP for the same reason. So when we say we don't want to deal with UDI, that doesn't mean that we are allergic, that we have become frightened of this monster that has suddenly arisen. Whole approach and conviction to politics, that we will deal with recognized political entities. We will deal with Muslim League, we will deal with NAP, we will deal with Convention Muslim League, we will deal with Jamaat-e-Islam, because they are recognized political personalities which do not suddenly, out of some expedient, necessity, conglomerate and get together to pressurize and blackmail established authority, government established constitutionally by law. For this reason, we cannot deal with UDI as such, but that presents no problems. Constitution is to be made inside the assembly, by the assembly, not by the UDI, by people who have been rejected by the electorate. We are therefore prepared to talk and hold discussions with members of the National Assembly, leaders of political parties in the National Assembly, but we cannot deal with any body that suddenly emerges for an expedient cause and for purpose of blackmail, and that does not enjoy the mandate of the people. So there is no deadlock here. I've given the reasons why we cannot deal with this body. At the same time, the substance of the matter is something which we are quite competent to discuss inside the National Assembly with some of the individuals who claim to be today a part of this transient passing little arrangement. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I've spoken for a great deal of time, but I've spoken to you after a long time, and I'm making an appeal to everyone, to every citizen of Pakistan, to every man, woman and child, to the laborers, to my peasant friends, to the ladies, to the women, to the children, to every citizen of Pakistan, as I said. But most of all, I'd like to speak to the students, appeal to them, the younger generation that was ever so kind to me. This is a generation which I adore, and I'm terribly fond of this generation. I can never forget that the youth of Pakistan gave me unanimous support when I left Ayub Khan's government in 1966. I had the unanimous support of the students of this country. And believe me, in my whole life, I have never considered any achievement greater than the achievement I felt when the whole of the youth of Pakistan rallied round me. That was a great sense of exaltation. And I tell you that I miss those days, because I know today that I don't enjoy that overwhelming support of the youth. I'm a realist. I don't indulge in illusions. I know that I don't enjoy that overwhelming support which I had at one time among the students, among the younger generation of our people. Why have I, to some extent, that support has been frittered away? There are certain reasons. Once you get into government, you cannot keep everyone satisfied. Some objective factors arise. But that's not all. The most important thing is that some of the youth got misled. I'm sorry if they don't like the word, I won't use it. Not misled, let us use another word, got disenchanted with me. It is because of the systematic, vicious propaganda of Jamaat-e-Islam. They told our younger generation, whose background rightly is Muslim, whose environment is Muslim, they told the younger boy, he's a socialist. And socialism is against Islam. Although socialism is not against Islam. There are socialist states in Egypt, in Libya, in so many other Muslim countries, in Algeria. And in the elections, the people decided that socialism was not against Islam. But Jamaat-e-Islam systematically poisoned the minds of the youth against me on the ground that Mr. Bhutto might be your idol. But don't forget he's a socialist. And therefore you are Muslims, as Muslims, you cannot follow a socialist. And they penetrated this propaganda. They drilled it in the schools, in the colleges, in the mosques, relentlessly, went on and on over the years to contaminate and to mislead the youth against me on the ground that I was a socialist. And then some people felt, all right, perhaps Islam is a mukamal zabta-e-hayat. Where is the room for socialism? So, Jamiatul Tulba, other organizations, they thought that Jamaat Islam is right. Now I like to address myself to my young friends, and I like to tell them to ask themselves the question that if that is the case, why the Jamaat Islami cooperating and forming a UDI, United Declaration of Illegality with the NAP? Is NAP not a socialist party? Does NAP not claim to be a socialist party? If we were supposed to be Ladinis, when did the NAPs become Dinis? You ask now this question, my young friends from the Jamaat Islami who have tried to exploit you. At least the Pakistan People's Party proudly proclaims to be a socialist party with nationalistic objectives. I don't know whether everyone can say that for the other party. But the Jamaat Islam today has become a bedfellow of the National Awami Party, which believes not only in socialism, or claims to believe not only in socialism, but which also, according to many people, is opposed to what is left of Pakistan. I'm not making that charge, but many people have come to that conclusion, rightly or wrongly. And objectively speaking, they have taken into account so many factors that have taken place recently, and the past, the Congress past and all that. So, why has the Jamaat Islami, claiming to be a religious body, claiming to be the custodian of the pristine principles of Islam, gone and merged itself and its identity with a socialist party which some people call a secessionist party? If it was a crime to be attached to a socialist who believed in the integrity of Pakistan, where is the justification for combining with a socialist party which some people think is a secessionist party and which has a Congress background? Where is the justification? And over what? Where is the deadlock? I've tried to tell you there's no deadlock over the Constitution. There is agreement, there's no conflict of principles. Then why has the Jamaat Islami gone and joined with that? Or I will ask conversely now, why has the NAP gone and joined with the Jamaat Islami? Heterogeneous elements, motley individuals with different outlooks, with different philosophies, with different approaches, who could not stand one another. It's like tying the tails of wild cats together. And for what reason do they want to tie their tails together? For what reason they want to disown all their principles, forsake all their so-called ideological principles? There is no justification. There is no reason. And there is only one reason. That is, they want chaos. They don't want to see stability. They don't want to see the progress of Pakistan. Now, we have taken the view that the opposition must return to the assembly. By returning to the assembly, they will be fulfilling their mandate. If they return to the assembly, I am prepared to write to them, not as UDI, but to some of the people in the assembly, or one of the leaders in the assembly. The government's view has been thus explained. Opposition has said, no, we are not going to the assembly until you reply to us. Now, how are we to break the deadlock? We have taken one position, our friends have taken another position. You know, in such situations, the best thing is to try and put yourself in the other man's shoes. And I am now trying to put myself in the shoes of the opposition. I hope they will also take the same position, try to put themselves in my shoes. We have to find a way to break the deadlock because too much is at stake and we cannot stand on false pride. We must proceed forward sensibly and decently. Now, I have been thinking about this. On the 27th of this month, the Minister for Interior, Khan Abdul Qayyum Khan, spoke to the nation over television, and he said that we are prepared to talk to the opposition inside the assembly. And that is a logical position. It is a correct position. And this has been our position. But I want to break the deadlock. So, once again, I am prepared to compromise. Once again, I am prepared to make the concession. Once again, I am prepared to eat the humble pie. Once again, I am not prepared to stand on false pride. Why? Is it because I have no feelings? Is it because that I have no pride? Is it because that I am not a sensitive individual? Certainly not. One of my weaknesses is that I have pride and I am a sensitive individual. But I can't stand on my weakness. I have to look at Pakistan's future. I have to look at the future of our people, their children and their children's children. I cannot therefore become arrogant. I have learned some bitter lessons from the tragedy of 1971. I therefore cannot take the position that since I have said this, since I have taken the stand, I cannot retract from it. I am not retracting from my stand. Within our principles, as I said, there's room for flexibility. Because so much is at stake, because the future of Pakistan is in the balance, I am prepared to suggest this to our friends in the opposition, that they can meet me on the 2nd of next month. Who can meet me? Those who met me when we came to the agreement of 20th of October. Those members inside the National Assembly, not outside the National Assembly, because those who are outside the National Assembly have no locus standi. They are not authorized or empowered to frame the Constitution. Those friends of ours who met me in October and came to an agreement on the 20th of October from the National Assembly, they are welcome to meet me again on the 2nd of next month. I give a date at 10 o'clock in the morning in the President's. Same individuals, same friends can come and hold discussions with me on matters which they regard to be controversial, on matters which they regard to be their demands. Now, after I have made this compromise, and after I have not stuck to our position rigidly and dogmatically in the national interest, not in my personal interest, I would expect from them, I would think it is logical that they should return to the National Assembly immediately. I am not imposing this as a condition because I know their mentality. I am not making any condition. I have accepted their point of view unconditionally that I will meet them on the 2nd of this month. Those who are inside the house, those whom I met in October, not those who are outside. Discuss with them what matters they regard to be controversial and what they regard to be their demands. Now this position I have accepted, but I am making a request in the national interest to them to take a reasonable position and go immediately back to the National Assembly. Not only that, I am prepared to say that those articles which they regard to be controversial, although they are not controversial because they have already agreed to them in the past, but never mind. Those that they regard to be controversial, they will not be debated and decided upon until our discussions are completed. Now what can be more reasonable than that? that I'm not imposing a condition that they go back to the assembly, but I make a request and I expect of them that as patriotic individuals, as people who have to fulfill a mandate to the nation, which is not to boycott but to participate, that we will meet on the 2nd of next month with those members of the National Assembly who are inside the assembly and whom we met in the past to discuss their points and what they have in their mind. They, in the meantime, we request them to go to the assembly and articles which they regard, not we regard, to be controversial, till our negotiations are completed, we will not take up those articles. There is no reason now, in the circumstances, that they should not go back to the National Assembly and fulfill their responsibilities, not to me, but to Pakistan and the people of Pakistan. And I can tell you that when I meet them, I'm prepared to discuss matters with them objectively and with an open mind. Because personally, I have nothing at stake. As I told you, the formula of 20th October was theirs. They thought I wanted a presidential system, and they said we will never have a presidential system. I said, all right. Then they thought I wanted the system of France, of the constitution of President de Gaulle, and they said we will never have a de Gaulle's constitution. I said, all right. Then they said we will have a system of parliamentary democracy where the power lies with the Prime Minister. I said, all right. They said that we say that the Prime Minister cannot be removed under certain circumstances. I said, all right, I accept your formula. Now then they go back and say, no, the President must have certain powers. The question is, we have gone up to the edge of the precipice. Because as I said, it's not my personal future that I'm looking at. In the past also I have given up office, and I am not a hanker of office. It's the future of Pakistan that I'm looking at, that's all. And that's why I'm prepared to make these adjustments, compromises. And as I said, eat the humble pie, eat the humble pie. I would never eat the humble pie on any personal matter. For generations we have fought and vendettas in our own localities on personal matters. But this is not a personal matter. I cannot have personal feeling on this question. This is an entirely impersonal matter. This is not my pride, it's the pride of Pakistan that is at stake. My pride will not be in any way affected if I say no, but the pride of Pakistan will be affected if I say no. That's why I'm not saying no, and I'm saying yes. And I'm saying that I'm prepared to make this compromise in a spirit of accommodation. But this shall be the final effort. We've had too many of these negotiations. This is final. No more negotiation after this. If this succeeds, we will all be happy. If this does not succeed, we will proceed with the task of framing the Constitution, because we have the right to frame the Constitution. It is desirable to have their participation and agreement. It is not necessary to have their participation and agreement. We will then proceed with the framing of the Constitution if, unfortunately, there is no settlement. And we will ensure that the people support the Constitution. We know the people want the Constitution. And we will give, inshallah ta'ala, a Constitution which is democratic, Islamic and federal in character, which ensures the independence of judiciary and gives fundamental rights to the citizens. All these things will happen if the negotiations succeed or if the negotiations do not succeed. We have given a date. We are going to stand by that date. We cannot go away from that date, because that is not my date. That is Pakistan's date with destiny, not my date with destiny. So this is the position. We are prepared to talk, discuss with an open mind, and you will see that we will be genuine. I cannot say anything more than that at the moment. But we will discuss constitutional problems. There are certain problems which are outside the Constitution. They have raised the question of new elections. How is new elections a constitutional provision? How is new elections a constitutional feature? New elections, whether they are held or not, is in the judgment and discretion of the government within the period of time that it has been given by the mandate, by the people. It has a tenure of office. And it is in the government's discretion and judgment to have those elections. And it's not a constitutional problem. My friends, in 25 years we had one election Now in 2 years they want another election. You know why they want an election? Because they were defeated in the elections. There is no other reason why they want another election. There is no other justification why they want an election, because they were defeated and they cannot wait for 5 years. They don't have the patience to wait for 5 years. They waited for 25 years when there was martial law and said Zindabad. But now, because there is a people's government which has a mandate from the people, they say no, somehow or the other we must have another election so that this government is replaced by them. They say that Mujibur Rahman had fresh elections. Well, Mujibur Rahman created a new country. He severed from Pakistan. He seceded from Pakistan. And it was necessary for him to have fresh elections. Here, we are up to our necks. Right up to our necks. The water has gone beyond the head. All these problems which I mentioned earlier. Economic problems, devaluation problems, food problems, sugar problems, wheat problems, smuggling, adulteration, law and order, interprovincial questions, Simla, India, Afghanistan, Iraq, great powers. We are all the time confronted with problems and problems and problems. We haven't had a moment's respite. We haven't had literally a minute's break. It's been a marathon, fatiguing session from the day we have taken over office. As I said, we had no time really to give basic reforms. Now, we have fulfilled many pledges of our manifesto. In spite of these difficult circumstances, in spite of the fact that the country was broken into two parts, and we lost the resources of East Pakistan and the manpower of East Pakistan, the foreign exchange of East Pakistan, the internal earnings of East Pakistan. In spite of all that, we have given basic reforms according to the manifesto in 1 year and a half, which no previous government of Pakistan has done. But our opposition friends keep telling the people that we have not fulfilled our manifesto. So they want to go to the elections prematurely, immediately, in a hurry, so that they go and tell the people that the People's Party has not fulfilled its manifesto. But the People's Party in 1.5 years has gone rapidly in trying to fulfill its manifesto, in spite of the fact that we are pulled in all different directions. Therefore, we have also a right to fulfill our manifesto so that we can go back to the people and say, no, look, this much of the manifesto we have fulfilled. How can these friends of ours do it both ways? On the one hand, they say this party has not fulfilled its manifesto. On the other hand, they don't want to give this party the tenure of its office to fulfill its manifesto. That is why they are craving for elections. But I told you earlier, we are not frightened of elections. If in our judgment, we believe that the internal and external situation demands elections, why should we be afraid of elections? You know, I am sensitive to public opinion. If I feel the public opinion wants elections, why should I say to public opinion that I am not going to agree with you? One of the leaders of the opposition said, you must say this much for him, that he is sensitive to public opinion. That when there is genuine public opinion, he does recognize it. Well, if they admit that much, then if there is going to be public opinion created, in spite of this great chaos that we have around us, and subversion and infiltration, if in spite of that the people want to go on that path, how should I and why should I stop them? But the judgment lies in the government's discretion within the tenure that it has at its disposal. And if I see that you want another fresh election and that you're sick and tired of my government and you're sick and tired of me, I'll be too happy not only to hold elections, but to vacate office, this office which I know is no bed of roses. How much a bed of thorns it is only known to those who sleep on it. So if that's your verdict, if that's what you want, I'm not doing anyone a favor by remaining a president of Pakistan. I'm not here for life. Don't I know that much? Am I so ignorant of the forces of history that I do not know that all this is a passing phenomena? But I believe, and I don't speak immodestly, I believe that I have a role to play for Pakistan. Whether it's as president or whether it's in the opposition or whether it's as like an ordinary citizen. From the age of 15 or 14, I have been passionately involved with this whole struggle of Pakistan, with the whole concept of Pakistan. At its most crucial points, I have had some modest part to play in the life of this nation. So it is immaterial to me that if I sense the public mood, the public demand for a new government, new elections, that will be no problem. It's not a question of pressure from the opposition. I'll willingly submit myself to the electorate. But, as I said, the discretion lies within the tenure of office. And that will be judged by the mood of the people. And in the meantime, we will proceed forward with our task, because this responsibility has been given to us until that is vacated from us by the people. By the people, and not by threats of a minority or from any other quarter. Any such threat will be crushed, and will be crushed ruthlessly, because it is only to the people we bow. It is only to the people we submit. We won't submit to a junta or to a coterie, because that is not the mandate that the people of Pakistan have given us. We will die with our boots on rather than to succumb and surrender and to run away. We don't run away either from the assemblies or from our responsibilities. We face them squarely in the face. And now they talk about caretaker government. In which country of the world they have caretaker governments when elections are held? If there is some mad country, I don't want Pakistan to go on the path of madness. Majority of the countries, 99% of the countries, there is no caretaker government. In America they hold elections, in Britain they hold elections, in India they hold elections, in Bangladesh they have held elections. Where was the caretaker government? Why should Pakistan be made the freak of all experiments? But you know, there is something more basic to this matter. Caretaker government they want because they cannot ever be elected by the people. They cannot be put into government by the vote of the people. Since they can never win elections, and therefore since through elections they can never come into government, they want to be in government at the crucial time to manipulate the elections in order to try and get into government. A party enjoying the majority of the people's support will never ask for caretaker government. You know, everyone says that if the basic democracy system was not there, if there was adult franchise, Miss Jinnah would have won the elections in 1965. Why? If there had been adult franchise. That means if the people had the power to vote, even Ayub Khan's basic democracies, even Ayub Khan's dictatorship could not have stopped Miss Jinnah from winning the elections. This is the biggest guarantee for fair elections. Adult franchise. When there are adult franchise, then the people have to see that they elect their representatives and that they are not deceived from electing their representatives. Those who do not have confidence in the power of the people, that the people will assert their rights to elect their representatives in an adult franchise elections, they who hate the people, who have contempt for the people, they will demand such stupid safeguards which are not to be found anywhere else in the world, because nowhere else in the world do people disrespect their people and have contempt for their people. The guarantee for free elections is in the hands of the people themselves. In the system of adult franchise. Yes, if there was no adult franchise, if there was basic democracies, then you might take this position that the people have no right as a whole to vote. The people cannot safeguard their democratic rights. Therefore, we want some arrangement to be able to manipulate or see to the fact that the indirect elections are held properly. But in direct elections, where the whole nation goes to vote, how can you then say the whole people cannot safeguard democracy? That means you do not trust the people. That means you do not have any confidence in the strength and the ability of the people to see to it that their verdict is honored and respected. That means you must introduce an element outside the people to be able to try and ensure something happens. If the people cannot ensure that such a thing can happen, then your contrivances cannot also ensure it. Therefore, trust the people and know the strength that they have. Appreciate their power, that they will not allow elections to be tampered with, that they will see to it that fair elections are held because it is their vote. And they will not have a fraud played upon them, on them. People will see to it that the fraud is not played upon them. Therefore, it's an insult to the people to demand these contrivances that you cannot trust the people, you do not feel that they can assert themselves to protect their rights and to prevent the fraud. Therefore, you must have some little manipulation. That is one objection. The second is, how can defeated people come into government at a crucial time? Then the best thing is not to win elections, but to lose elections. Then let us all lose elections and at the crucial time come into office and manipulate the elections and then get elected. These are unique considerations, unique suggestions. That's why the whole world does not accept them. Now it's giving me an example of some mad country. As I said, we can't take Pakistan on the path of madness. And now the third point is that how can the executive liquidate its responsibility which it has been given up to a certain period of time and give it over to a member of the judiciary? If you give it over to the member of the judiciary, why not to a member of the armed forces? If you want a judge of the Supreme Court to be the caretaker government, why not the general of the army? Why not the chief of staff? Why not the chief of air force? Because the judiciary has its own responsibility. The armed forces have their own responsibility. The executive has its own responsibility. You can't transplant in this fashion. Today I am the President of Pakistan. Can I go and sit as a Supreme Court Chief Justice? Can I go and become the Chief of Staff of the Army or the Chief of Staff of the Air Force? I am the Supreme Commander as President. But I can't take over the day-to-day administration of the armed forces or the day-to-day administration of the judiciary. How then can you supplant one organ of government into another organ of the state for a purpose so that you see to it that people don't defeat you and you can manipulate to get elected? Yes, when I go out of the country, someone officiates for me. If a governor of the province goes, then the Chief Justice of the High Court officiates. But that is for one individual, for a temporary arrangement for one individual. Here you want the whole establishment. Here you want the whole executive establishment to relinquish its authority which has been given to it by the people and introduce an alien authority outside the scope of the authority of the executive to take over charge of the whole executive. Is this not a coup d'etat against democracy? How can you strengthen the roots of democracy in that fashion? So these talks, juvenile, adolescent, immature, from old people, from old warriors, from moth-eaten, antediluvian individuals, to come up with such unprofound things, to insult the intelligence of this nation in such a fashion? Is this what is going to be our legacy after 5,000 years of civilization? That we come up across such unique and absurd suggestions made in sheer desperation, completely devoid of all logic and understanding and reason, so that our people should laugh at us and the world should laugh at us, that we should make monkeys out of ourselves like that merely because we are not in office. The Britishers, they made us learn how to do the salam. We know how to do the salam very well. All of us can joko and do the salam. But they did not teach us how to take the salami. That they took themselves. And in 25 years, we have not yet learned how to do it democratically. How to take the salami also democratically. No, democracy is good only if I am in government. Democracy is of the majority only if I have the majority. Democracy is of the minority if I am not in the majority. All sorts of absurd factors and innovations should be introduced only because even if the people do not want to get them into office, that nevertheless we should get into office. That's how they did the elections of the Punjab. It's their own conscience that is biting them. Because they manipulated elections in Sindh, in Punjab, in Frontier. Their own sins are telling on them. We will not do things like that. Because we have the confidence of the people and we trust the people. So, gentlemen, the constitutional problem, because these are constitutional problems. Problems outside the Constitution, you have heard me and I have spoken on them. Now, finally, in conclusion, I want to say to you, to ask you, should our attitude always be negative? You know, we see the world going ahead. We see everyone moving forward. We see deep prejudices broken between so many countries. Historical antagonists have resolved their disputes. Science has made great strides. Technology has broken fresh ground. Science has achieved things which were not in the wildest imagination of man. This 20th century of ours has brought about miraculous advances in medicine, in education, in literature. Everywhere people are on the move. Everywhere the world is going ahead. I see it with envy when I look at Europe, when I look at America, when I look at certain parts of Africa, Asia. Everywhere things are on the move. Sense of hope, energy, people full of vitality. They look forward to a tomorrow and they put their heads together, and out of the most complex of difficulties and complex of disputes, they arrive at settlements. But here, what is our future? How are we going to proceed? Always fighting, always quibbling, always generating tension, always spreading the poison, always suspicious. Is that our food? Hate, tension. Is that the source of our sustenance? I do not think so. I do not think that this is what our people want. I don't think the people want this negative, nihilist approach to life and to problems. I think the people are determined, they're craving for a positive contribution. People are trying to move ahead, break the chains of the past which have bound them, body and soul, and eaten into their vitals. They want a better tomorrow. They hope for a better future for their children. They have reposed confidence in my party and in me for that purpose, and inshallah, I will see to it, come what may, that this comes about, and this happens in Pakistan. I'm quite determined, and I'm quite certain that these days will pass, and the rainbow on the sky will come. There will be a rainbow, I assure you, people of Pakistan, that there will be a rainbow on the sky, in which you will partake, which will be your rainbow. So let us not be negative. We are negative to the Constitution. We are negative to reforms. We are negative to Bangladesh. We are negative to India. We are negative to the settlement of disputes, Kashmir. We are negative on the question of prisoner of wars. Everything, no, no, no. Everything, there's a no. Where can we break the ground? If you keep saying no, if you keep refusing, you don't have the power in the first place to keep on saying no, no to the whole world. But some or the other illusion, make-believe, it's gone into our heads, into our leadership is responsible for not educating the people. They have not told the people of their strength, their true strength. They have not told the people of the implications of spiral in the expenditure on defense. They have not told the people how we are suffering on account of non-settlement of disputes with India. They have not told the people of the benefits of recognition of Bangladesh. Na manzoor, everything no. Well then, what do you expect? That is the question. If you keep saying no, if you keep saying no to reality, if you keep saying no to... If by now I had not been so sensitive to these matters, and if I had gone ahead and recognized Bangladesh, you would have found today Bengalis from Dhaka sitting here at different levels, ministers, bureaucrats, businessmen, all getting together, again
trying to rekindle and refoster the threads that broke. I want to pick up those threads and tie them together. Only way you can do it is by recognizing them. You, the people I know, have understood it by now, and you, I think, will be prepared to trust me in this judgment, because I'm not doing it for my sake. I'm not doing it for myself. I'm doing it for Pakistan. I'm doing it for you. I have no stake in the recognition of Bangladesh. I have no stake in taking this unpleasant decision, and it is an unpleasant decision. But I know that is the only way that we can pick up that thread there, pick up the thread and tie it. The only way where we can get there and they can get here. That's the only reason. It's in the interest of Muslim Bengal, it is in the interest of Muslims of Pakistan, it is in the interest of the Muslims of the subcontinent. And as far as India is concerned, well, we have reached a stalemate, but the stalemate also should be broken. It should be broken. There should be some development, some equitable and a genuine development. And I believe that these difficulties will be surmounted. They must be surmounted in the interest of Pakistan and in the name of the people of Pakistan. And I can assure you that as far as I am concerned, I live dangerously. I have played with my life very often. And for the sake of Pakistan, it means nothing to me, absolutely nothing, if I have to lay down my life for my countrymen and for my people. My people have done so much for me. They have given me honor, respect. How can I repay them? I simply cannot repay them. All that I can do is that I can continue to serve them to the best of my ability, with integrity and with full faith in God and His mercy on humanity, because He is the God of all world, not only the God of Pakistan. But we know that this God of all world will also like to see that this tormented land, which has come in the name of Islam, the final message of God on earth, will not be forsaken by Him. In Him we repose our full confidence, and in the people of Pakistan we repose our full trust. How can we fail, my friends, my countrymen, students, ladies and gentlemen?